Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument. My first guest is Colin Barrows. He is co-chair of Citizen Science Programs for Friends of the Desert Mountains and is a biologist by training. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here.
Your nonprofit organization is involved in trying to study and protect the animals and plants in this national monument, which is next to Palm Springs, near Idlewild in the San Jacinto Mountains, down south next to the Anza Borrego. Perhaps you could tell us where we're really located. About 2.5 hours southeast of Los Angeles, about 2 hours north of San Diego.
Right, so before we had all of those cities come in here, we're sitting in a place where we're at the confluence of several different natural areas. We've got Baja California coming up from the south, and we've got mountains coming from the north. The Sierra Range terminates not too far north of here. We've also got the San Andreas Fault running right through the middle of our valley, which means that we've got different plants and animals coming from the east and west.
Such a wide range of ecosystems because you have the desert at about 1,000 feet above sea level. The San Jacinto mountain peak is over 10,800 feet, and you have ridges and valleys and canyons in between. So what are these various kinds of natural areas called?
Right where we're sitting in the middle on the Colorado Desert, which is part of the Sonoran Desert, which is found throughout the southwestern United States. We're in the middle of the Colorado Desert. As you move up the mountain, you're going through Pinyon Pine and juniper ecosystems. A little higher, you get into yellow pine, forest ecosystems, and even at the very higher areas, you can get into some alpine ecosystems.
My cabin at 5,000 feet in Idlewild has oaks and cedars as well as pines. And so each one of these kinds of plant communities hosts a different kind of animal community. Here in the desert, there are the Bighorn Sheep. In the mountains, I've never seen one live, but I know that there are mountain lions. I see the signs, beware.
Yeah, we see signs of mountain lions all over the place, but we almost never see them. It would be a treat.
What I do see every time I go hiking are the reptiles, the snakes. We even have rattlesnakes, and just walk around them. Be careful. They don't want to bite me. I don't want them to bite me. Lizards, lots of them. How many different kinds of species are there?
Well, reptiles are definitely one of our main groups of animals that we find here, and there's, just in lizards alone, there's at least 30 species that can be found within this area that we're sitting in now.
And, of course, what animals eat them? I know I often see coyotes. They are around all the time.
Yeah, coyotes would eat lizards. All kinds of birds would be going after lizards. That brings in the snakes, of course, like lizards, and even lizards like each other sometimes for eating.
In terms of mammals, there are the deer. Just one species or many?
One species, the mule deer we have, and then, of course, the bighorn sheep, which are not deer, but related.
But the bighorn sheep don't look like the sheep that are domesticated.
No, we've got our own sheep over here on the Northern American continent compared to the sheep which we've brought in from Europe. But actually, the bighorn sheep we have are found all throughout Western North America, but we have our own subspecies here, or subgroup here, and just in the peninsular ranges, which is an endangered group of bighorn sheep, which we're trying to protect in the monument.
There are rodents because the larger predators need to eat the smaller ones. A lot of people don't like mice and rats, but they're important to the ecosystem.
Absolutely. In fact, mice are one of those other areas where we have a lot of diversity. There's probably another 30 or 40 or maybe even more species of rodents, some of which are only found in the valley or in the mountains where we live. And there are a lot of diversity and a lot of different adaptations to different plant communities or other animal communities found among the rodents here.
The desert tortoise needs a lot of protection. It is considered an endangered species?
Yes, absolutely. It's a federally endangered species.
How many other federally endangered species are there? And of course, there's also the state endangered species list.
Yeah, we have a lot, actually. We have 27 species that we look at under our multiple species habitat conservation plan in the local area. And many of those are endangered either federally or by the state or both.
The desert tortoise is found at the desert. At what point does it no longer go? Where is its habitat in relationship to the higher mountains areas?
We're actually sitting right about at the height. We're at about 1,000 feet right now, and they stopped being found right about here. Less an elevation thing. They really like it hot. They're reptiles, and they eat a lot of vegetation, and when they eat a lot of vegetation, they need heat to digest that plant matter. So they live at lower elevations where it stays nice and hot.
And of course, this visitor center where we are is in Palm Desert, right next to Palm Springs. Summertime can be over 110 degrees. It's hot.
It's very hot, yeah. Actually, we've had a little bit of a mild summer this year, but it's still been in the hundreds for the last month and a half at least.
But it's interesting. I just drove down from Idlewild at 5,000 feet, and it was pleasant, cool in the mid-70s.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we have this great diversity of animals and plants is the animals. Some of the animals like it hot, and some of them like it cool, and some of them move back and forth different times of years.
When one goes higher in the wintertime, there's snow on those mountain peaks, so it can be below freezing, snowing. Down in Palm Springs, it can be in the mid-70s.
Absolutely.
So we find that both the animals and the plants vary according to the elevation, according to the precipitation, according to the kind of food source available. What about the birds? They fly all over. Will we find the same hawks and eagles and predators, owls at the higher elevation as well as down here in the desert?
In many cases, yes, but in many cases, no. I mean, there's certain species like a great horned owl, which is sort of a cosmopolitan species that can be found just about anywhere in North America. And there's other animals that only will be found at the very tops of the mountains or will only be found at the below sea level, even down by the Salton Sea.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the special species that you have been focusing on. The Pinyon Pine. Again, higher up, we find many different kinds of pines, conifers, as they are called. There are many different species, but the pinyon are sort of in a mid-range, what, about 2,000 to 4,000 feet areas?
Yeah, maybe about 3,000 to 6,000 with some outliers in particularly dry upper areas or wet lower areas.
What's the distinguishing feature of a pinyon pine compared to some of the other pines?
Well, pinyon pines are what's known as a nut pine, so they have a very large nut compared to other pines, which is a great resource for animals who want to eat that big nut, or even in the past, culturally, the Kauai would have used them as a very important food source. They're in this middle elevation between the higher elevation and the lower elevation, and that makes them a very important species to look at as far as climate change and things going forward. So we've been researching those pinyon pines to try and understand how their range may be changing in response to changing patterns in temperature or rainfall.
As a scientist, you normally don't want to give the answers until you're 110% correct, but where is the research going? How is climate change affecting them? What are we learning about climate change from studying the pinyon pine?
Right. It's hard to say for sure what's happening, but definitely my feeling is that the pinyon pines are not doing very well in our local mountains. Many areas are experiencing large die-offs, and perhaps more importantly, there's not a lot of reproduction happening or not a lot of recruitment happening. There's not new trees growing in the place of the old ones that die. So what we're trying to do now is really kind of focus on trying to find those places where they are still recruiting new trees and figure out what makes those places unique, and maybe we can protect those areas specifically.
We're here in Southern California. What is the range of a pinyon pine?
Well, there's many different species of pinyon pine, or several different species of pinyon pines. Locally, we've got two species, the single-leaf pinyon pine and the four-leaf pinyon pine. The single-leaf pinyon pine is found north of us, up into the Sierras, up into southern Idaho, I believe. And the four-needle pinyon pine actually comes to us south from Baja, California.
Pinyon pines were very important to the Native American Indians who lived in the area. It was a major food source and source for other uses. How can the pine be used?
Well, it's used as a food source. Pine nuts are consumed by people all over the world. They're also used as Christmas trees in some areas and things like that, where they're farmed. In our area, though, we're mostly a protected species that we're looking at for the preservation of the animals because they're so important. They have this large seed that's very nutritious, and it's a sort of what we would call a keystone species. It's important, so important that if it were to disappear, many other plants and animals would disappear along with it.
You have also studied extensively some of the reptiles in the area. What are some of the distinguishing behaviors, characteristics, animals that are only found here, and how do they relate to the various vegetative ecosystems?
So down in the valley floor, we've got Palm Springs and Palm Desert area. Was once, maybe 100 years ago, was once a huge sand dune ecosystem. In that ecosystem, there were a couple of unique lizards called Coachella Valley fringe-toed lizard and a flat-tailed horned lizard. And those are the two of the species that we look at very carefully now because as we've developed the sand dune ecosystem that was once their home, there's now less than 5% of their original habitat left. So we're looking very closely at that remaining 5% and trying to make sure that we're not damaging it any further, that those species and those populations are still going to be able to last for future generations.
And I know some of the developers aren't happy about those species preventing some of their construction work.
Right. It's been an ongoing sort of challenge, but conservationists and developers have worked together to develop what's called a multiple species habitat conservation plan. And that allows for some development and allows for, very importantly, the preservation of these species in our area. Thanks to the hard work of a lot of people, we're in a good situation now, or a relatively good situation now.
The Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument covers about 280,000 acres. And then there's additional open land that belongs to the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, county, state agencies, many different entities, as well as an Indian reservation. So there's a lot of natural area with a lot of species. And I know the question that biologists like you don't like to answer, but I've always got to ask, how many plants and animals are there? Or shall we say, how many are on the list? And of course, as you're out there studying, I'm sure you're still discovering some new species.
Yeah, the number of species changes all the time, especially if you get down into the little creepy crawlies.
The insects.
Yes, those guys. So we talked about reptiles. There's maybe 100 species of reptiles. We talked about birds. There's probably a couple hundred species of birds. We're a very important migratory area, so we get a lot of birds coming through seasonally. You get into plants. We've got about 300 or 400, at least, plant species that could be found within maybe 100 miles of where we're sitting now. There's a lot of plant diversity here.
And, of course, the mammals?
And mammals, yeah. There's many species of mammals, mostly very small ones. We've only got a couple of big species like the bighorn sheep and the mountain lion. But we've got probably maybe 20 to 30 species of bats, 20 to 30 species of small rodents, of course, jackrabbits and that sort of thing as well.
And I do like the fact that they're bats because I see them in Idlewild in the evening around dusk. They're flying around. They're wonderful to watch. They are our natural pest control. They're not going to hurt us. We don't have to worry about them.
Absolutely. Bats are one of my favorite, and it's actually one of the animals that we've studied in our citizen science. We've got volunteers that have gone out and studied yellow bats. There's a bat living in the Palm Springs area called a yellow bat, which is only found in the Colorado desert where we live, and it specifically likes to live in the skirts of palm trees, which are found, we've got a lot of in our area, of course. So our volunteers have helped researchers determine what kinds of palm trees or what kinds of palm oases this bat specifically like.
And we should mention that in terms of palms, Southern California generally does not have palms, even though that's an iconic plant in Los Angeles. It's exotic. The real native palm is only found in this area.
That's right. There's only one native palm in California called the California fan palm, and it's only found mostly right in this area. We've got several tens of thousands of them found in our little canyons and oases in this area. And that is the only native palm in California. The rest of them, all the date palms and everything else, were all brought in from Asia.
There is so much to enjoy and appreciate and to learn about, and all of these plants and animals are very critical to human survival as well.
Absolutely. I wish it were more understood how the natural environment and the plants and animals go along with that contribute to our lives as humans, even if we don't necessarily go out hiking or go out and experience it. The plants and animals and the ecosystem contributes to the water, the clean water and clean air and everything else that we need as a society.
I'd like to thank you so very much for studying all of this flora and fauna and providing that important information for us. And thank you very much for being my guest.
Well, thank you for learning.
I have been speaking with Colin Barrows, who is the co-chair of the Citizen Science Programs with Friends of the Desert Mountains. We'll be back in a moment with more ecological issues.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
My next guest to talk about the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument and the Coachella Valley is Jennifer Prado. She is Conservation Lands Manager for Friends of the Desert Mountains, is a licensed attorney and former public defender. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've been talking about a beautiful area of Southern California, but it hasn't always been protected for the public. You're very involved in land acquisition to set aside conservation areas that will become part of the federal, state, public system so that everybody can enjoy them?
That's correct. Through Friends of the Desert Mountains, I handle all of the land acquisitions, and all the land that we acquire is for conservation in perpetuity.
So describe how you separate the Coachella Valley, which has Indio, Palm Springs, Palm Desert, with the San Jacinto Mountains, where Idlewild is, above Hemet and Banning, and the Santa Rosa Mountains, which is just north of the Anza Borrego State Park.
For our purposes, we consider the Coachella Valley to be essentially bounded by the boundaries of the Coachella Valley Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan. So it encompasses about 1.2 million acres of land, and the boundary is essentially the Banning Pass and all the way out to essentially Chirrocco Summit off of the I-10 freeway. And in the mountains, it's the ridge line of the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto mountains. And on the northeastern side, it would be the boundary, essentially, of Joshua Tree National Park.
What is the biggest challenge in getting land conveyances that go to the governmental agencies that make the lands open for the public?
The biggest challenge is actually doing the transaction with federal government agencies. It's quite a time-consuming process, but it's well worth it.
You were a former commercial real estate broker, former public defender, you're an attorney, so that must help. In addition to your interest in conservation and the environment, you're combining all of that. So when you go out and look at a piece of land, do you ever say, oh, we don't need that, or do you take everything that's available?
Well, resources are actually limited. Our funding sources are mainly through a partnership with a state agency called the Coachella Valley Mountains Conservancy. They use state bond funds, and we get grants of those funds to purchase a lot of our land. And we also partner with a private nonprofit foundation called the Resources Legacy Fund for purchases in the wilderness areas. So we do have priority areas that we look at, but we will consider pretty much anything that's a good conservation prospect.
You obviously are working with other nonprofit organizations in the long-term acquisition as well as management. So different groups have different focuses. I know that the Friends of the Desert Mountains has programs to remove invasive plant species, to do property cleanup, to have educational hikes and programs as well as scientific research. You're focused on trying to get lands. So how does it all come together?
For me, since I have a background in real estate, it just kind of fell naturally to me to be in the position of doing the land transactions here. And it's the best job I've ever had. But my passion, and sometimes they do let me get out of the office to go and pull weeds and do restoration. That's what I love to do.
Because we're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. You can't obviously see every single piece of property in this habitat management area. So who determines how valuable it is for preservation, for acquisition? Who comes to you, or do you go out and drive around and hike around and say, ooh, we want that?
Well, we're very fortunate here in the Valley to have a very close-knit conservation community. And the partners, like for example, the state and federal partners that we work with, as well as local biologists and government agencies, will get together and we'll talk about what the priorities are for conservation. And it takes into account the species that can be found there. It takes into account the effects of trying to mitigate climate change for varied habitats for the different species, as well as the threat of development.
Wildlife corridors are critical for larger species, particularly like the bighorn sheep, the mountain lions. They need a lot of land, a lot of territory, and they can't just be isolated in little protected pockets of parks. They have to have a large expanse to share a gene pool to be able to survive. So I would assume that looking at lands that connect already protected areas is top priority?
Absolutely. And several of the projects that we've worked on targeting parcels to reach out to landowners to see if they're willing to sell their land have focused on those areas for specifically that reason, to allow the species to be able to travel and roam in their native area.
Is the land that you're focusing on generally still undeveloped, or do you ever see pieces of land that are needed for these connecting corridors and to expand protected areas and decide you have to tear down a building or two or set aside the building for other uses?
We generally focus on vacant land, and we'll reach out to those sellers in areas that we've targeted and see if they're willing to sell. And we only buy from willing sellers, so essentially if they have land that is vacant and ready for conservation and a good prospect, then we'll reach out to those. Every once in a while there will be, for example, an owner might want to donate a piece of property with a structure on it, and at that point we have to determine whether it makes sense for us to do that.
In state parks, federal parks, there are often pockets of land called inholdings. These are private property that's surrounded by the park, has not been acquired by the park, still belongs to a private entity. And I know here in the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument, there's massive wilderness area up in the San Jacintos, but there's a tramway that goes into a wilderness zone. And wilderness is supposed to have things that are just natural, not made by humans. That would be considered an inholding? Is there ever a consideration to try and remove such an establishment?
I think when it comes to the tram, it's so established and so well loved and such a draw for the community for recreation that that's here to stay. But we do have a regular program that's supported by funding from our partners to buy in holdings specifically within wilderness areas. So we do like to fill in those pockets and essentially buy them up so that we can then transfer them to the federal government or whichever agency is responsible for long-term management.
How many pieces of land are you looking at? How many need to be acquired? How much money is going to be required to really round out the National Monument, the Coachella Valley Habitat Conservation Area?
Well, it's hard to say. I haven't actually tallied it up myself, but I know that to date, the acquisition partners in the Coachella Valley have acquired 80,000 acres, and I think the ultimate goal for all partners and permittees under the plan is something like 200 and something thousand acres, so we've got a ways to go.
What's your favorite piece that you're working on now?
One of my favorite pieces is one that we just acquired in the Santa Rosa Wilderness, and it's essentially on top of one of the peaks, very difficult to get to, but it's a favorite of mine because there was actually some trash left up there. The previous owner had planned to do something with it and had taken up gear and put a water tank on it and done some other things, and all of that stuff was just left there to disintegrate. And so we were able to cooperate with the Bureau of Land Management to get that property cleaned up and back to its pristine state.
We're talking about an area of Southern California that the United States Forest Service manages. A lot of the mountain area, the mountain communities down toward the desert. The Bureau of Land Management owns a lot of land, but you have cities from Palm Springs, Palm Desert, Indio. You have counties, the county of Riverside. You have even the Santa Rosa Indian Reservation. Which agencies are really working with nonprofit groups like yours successfully, and which agencies need to make some changes, and what would they be to make acquisition of land available for the public to really create bigger and better public lands?
I mean, the agencies we work with on a regular basis include the BLM and the Forest Service and the Coachella Valley Association of Governments through the Coachella Valley Conservation Commission, as well as Coachella Valley Mountains Conservancy. Those kind of are the big ones. We also work with the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians. We work with the University of California, Riverside, essentially you name it. We're very, very fortunate in the Coachella Valley to have a very dedicated conservation community that encompasses cities and county government, and as well as federal and state government and private and nonprofit entities. The only thing we could probably do better is perhaps communicate more and maybe work together a little bit more cohesively, but that can be a challenge.
Find more money to buy the land?
That's always an issue, yes.
I'd like to thank you so very much for trying to preserve and protect these important conservation lands for all of us to enjoy. As you've been working on trying to acquire lands for the public good and for the wildlife that so much needs the wild areas, what are you finding to be the biggest challenge? What are you finding to be the best thing that has happened?
The biggest challenge is undoubtedly the vast amount of dumping that goes on in our area, honestly, and trying to keep properties clean. I think moving forward, the greatest thing that I would potentially be able to accomplish would be to prevent that from happening through a major education program to get people to stop dumping trash in the desert.
Open lands are not for dumping. We have proper facilities to handle that, and of course most materials should be recycled and reused if possible, and it's not for dumping of animals either.
That's correct. Pretty much what we really are striving for is for people to be able to enjoy the land and get out and recreate on it and enjoy the scenery and the gorgeous views that we have here in the Coachella Valley, but to respect it as well and leave it better than when they found it.
Thank you so very much for your good work, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I have been speaking with Jennifer Prado, who is Conservation Lands Manager with Friends of the Desert Mountains. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.